Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Plastic Podcast, the show that tells the science and the story of our relationship with plastic. I am your host, Clark Marchese, and today we are serving literature, poetry, and plastic. All right, but before we jump into it, we always get started with the trivia question. So the question for today is, it is difficult to see which of the following animals with an infrared camera? A, snakes, B, sharks, C, polar bears, and D, frogs. Now we have a reptile, a fish, a mammal, and an amphibian. That's not necessarily a hint, but those are your choices. Spotify listeners can answer directly on the episode page of the app, and everyone else can DM me on Instagram at Pine Forest Media for a chance to win a monthly prize. And stick around to the end of the credits to hear the answer to last week's trivia question and also a lovely review from one of you. Okay, plastic and poetry. That's what we're here for today, and we're going to speak to a poet who writes about plastic. Allison Cobb is her name, and in addition to being a poet, she is a published author with 20 years of experience in the field of environmental issues. I came across Allison Cobb's book, Plastic, an Autobiography, when I was looking for books on the history of plastic. Her book is, and also isn't that. It's a collection of vignettes of poetry and prose that, when woven together, reveal the interconnectedness of plastic on our planet. It draws lines between the milestones in plastic's invention, the Second World War, ocean debris, wildlife stressors, the automotive industry, intergenerational justice, and the author's own life. So obviously, I needed to have this person on this show. Together, we delved into her creative process as a poet and discussed the role of literature in recognizing emotional responses to environmental destruction as a vital component of activism and change. We explored the major themes and metaphors that weave through her pages, and you'll also get some bits of plastic history. Now, without further ado, I hope you enjoy this episode. All right, welcome, Allison. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. The first question I have is if you could just introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Clark. I'm happy to be here. I'm Allison Cobb. I'm a writer, author of 4 books, most with an environmental focus, and I also work as a director for justice and equity at the Environmental Defense Fund, a U.S.-based environmental nonprofit that's been around since the late 60s. They do work all around the world now, and they have many programs, including mainly climate, also work in oceans and food production and a range of things, but a really big focus on climate right now.
You have written 4 books so far. One of them is titled Plastic, an Autobiography, and that's the one I'd like to focus on primarily today. You probably get asked this question a lot, but why did you decide to write about plastic? What is it about plastic that you find so poignant?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I started thinking about writing this book, it was back in 2010, and I wanted to write a book about the current era and all of the global changes happening with the climate and pollution and plastic. And at the time, it sounds maybe a little odd to say now, but at the time, climate change felt quite abstract for many people still. And so I thought I would write about plastic because I think pretty much everyone has an intimate daily relationship with plastic. So that's why I settled on that.
So to give people an understanding of what this book is, because if you say someone wrote a book about plastic, that can mean a lot of things. It's not like, well, the first cellulose nitrate was developed in 1897 and so on and so on. So it's not a strictly historical book in that sense, but it's also not a scientific book either. It's more a work of poetry. Can you explain to us what this book is?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The book is where it goes on bookshelves in the bookstore. It's classified as creative nonfiction. I agree with you. It, kind of dwells in a middle space between poetry and prose, which is where a lot of my writing dwells. And as you mentioned, it's written in very short sections that kind of overlap with one another and weave together. So you're right. It isn't, 50 ways to cut down on your plastic use or a historical look at plastic. It is much more personal.
Yeah, it was very interesting for me to see this different approach because we don't often see poetry in the mainstream media when it comes to addressing environmental issues. But environmental issues have always inspired art in all its forms, particularly in protest. So can you speak to the power of poetry in addressing environmental issues?
Having worked in the environmental field for more than 20 years, I've really come to be deeply committed to the idea that the sort of fundamental changes in our relationship with the planet that we will need to undertake are going to require not only technological, legal, and policy solutions, but also a real commitment to environmental justice and equity. But all of that also is going to take enormous amounts of imagination, different kinds of thinking, and an honoring of lots of feelings involved. Grief about species we're losing, about changes in our own lives related to climate change, and, hopefully also some joy about the possibilities for change. I think all of those together may begin to be adequate for the kinds of solutions that we need. But I'm very committed to the power of creativity, emotion, and feeling to drive, really serious solutions. Those ideas are often kind of discounted, I think, in a European-based culture that's very focused on science and rationality, but I consider them really critical.
That's so interesting because I do see almost a slight contradiction in the way that your approach may be considered a niche because we don't see it often. But when we think of a niche, that's typically something that applies to a very specific subject or appeals to a very specific audience. But I think in this case, it's actually the other way around. On this show, I talked to academic researchers who have dedicated their entire careers to focusing on that specific topic or that very specific solution to address a larger problem. And that's essential, right? We need scientists, economists, policymakers to engage with challenges like this. But your approach is much more accessible than the majority of the scientific papers that get published about, oxo-biodegradable plastics that are impacting soil microbiomes, etc. So I like that you're filling this space that, despite having broad appeal, is still underrepresented. And I hope that people start to engage more in this area.
I feel like one of the great gifts of being trained as a poet is that it gives me, I joke, poetic license to explore science and history and do even ethnographic interviews in a way that people who have to maintain within the confines of their professional field would not venture to do. And I do hope that that's a very human approach and matches our very human curiosity as a species, right?
I want to start to talk about the book itself, which you approach through a very personal lens. So can you tell us about your personal relationship with plastic and how it finds its way into the pages?
Sure. Well, trained as a poet, I have a Master's of Fine Arts in Poetry, and I feel like everything that I write, even if it looks like prose on the page, comes from a creative, poetry-informed lens. So I approach topics as a creative writer, not as a journalist or historian or environmental scientist. And the way that I found to get my arms around this vast technology of plastic that takes so many forms that it almost disappears in our daily life because it's so ubiquitous was to just really take a personal look at everywhere my own life intersected with this technology. And I hoped that by approaching it through a really personal lens would make it very relatable for people.
One metaphor that comes up quite a bit is that of the albatross. What can you tell me about that?
In terms of the albatross, that actually was the original inspiration for writing the book. Years before I started, I think it was about 2004 or 2005, I saw a photograph of an albatross that had died after ingesting plastic. And I don't know if you or listeners are familiar with these photographs. Albatross chicks in the Pacific Islands are fed usually things like fish eggs, by their parents who go out and hunt food, but they're also increasingly picking up plastic waste and feeding it to their chicks. And eventually the chicks get so much plastic inside them that they can't digest that they die. And there are very haunting photographs taken by a photographer called Chris Jordan of decaying albatross chicks with the plastic inside them fully intact. One of the and I think maybe the very earliest of these photographs was taken by a different photographer named Susan Middleton. And the plastic inside of that bird contained one shard that had the markings from a World War II airplane squadron. So that piece of plastic had been floating around in the ocean for like 60 years before a bird picked it up and fed it to its chick. And I read about that. It was just kind of a stray thing I read, and it just lodged in my brain as something that I wanted to know about and stayed there until I actually started to investigate and engage with it.
Listeners can find this photo through the show notes or in our socials, but also the albatross, if we're doing a bit of literary analysis, is a very poignant metaphor in a very famous poem. It's called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. I read it when I was in 8th grade. Shout out to Mrs. Baker, but I imagine it is not a coincidence because the metaphor serves a very similar function in your work as it does in the poem.
Yeah, in the Western literature canon, that poem by Coleridge is quite famous. It's a 19th century poem, Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And what happens in that poem is that one of the sailors on the ship shoots an albatross that has been following the ship and sort of eating its scraps. And after that act of sort of wanton violence, because they don't use the albatross for anything, it was just, sort of for sport, it was shot. The ship becomes really cursed, and actually everyone on it dies, except for the mariner. And because this was happening, the rest of the crew took the dead albatross and hung it around the mariner's neck and forced him to wear this decaying bird. And that metaphor has taken it on a life in our culture. Listeners may have heard about, this albatross around my neck, which means like a burden. That's something it's just, hard to carry around. And what happens in the poem is that then the mariner, who's the only one who lives, goes and just tells his tale everywhere to anyone who will listen. And it's kind of it was sort of at the height of the Industrial Revolution in England. It was kind of a warning to the rest of the world about the dangers of environmental destruction.
Well, I think the albatross also represents an action that can't be undone. Theoretically, we could stop all plastic production soon, but we can't undo all the plastic that is already out there. But I think it also signifies a visual representation of a mistake, something that you can see that constantly reminds you of your crimes, we might say. And I also think it represents guilt. I think guilt is one emotion that comes up a lot with environmental destruction. So this photo of the albatross, the reference to the literary canon, and the emotional dimension of plastic pollution. This is just one example of how your book draws connections, but there's one more connection with the albatross, which is you were mentioning that one of the pieces of plastic found inside of it is sort of a war artifact, and war becomes another major theme of your work. Why did you decide to highlight war? And perhaps what is the link between the history of plastic and the history of war?
Yeah, they're actually really intimately linked. And the reason that war shows up in the book is not only the link to that piece of plastic in the albatross, but also because of the link to my own life. So I was born and raised in Los Alamos in New Mexico in the United States, which is where the first atomic bombs were created and which remains one of the nation's 3 nuclear labs. My father was a nuclear physicist there. And I just happened to learn in my research about plastic that polyethylene, which now is the most common plastic on the planet, it's in water bottles, it's in your pipes in your house, probably, it's in just about everything. It was a new material, brand new material in the 1950s. People weren't exactly sure what to do with it, but it turned out to be critical to the design of the hydrogen bomb, the first thermonuclear bomb. So I happened across that. And so there was a link to my own life. And I also came to understand that World War II was really the inflection point. It's, post-World War II is called the age of acceleration, when fossil fuel and other technologies really took off. Polyethylene was one of the first petroleum-based plastics. And plastic production and nuclear weapons and nuclear technologies just really blasted off after World War II. Plastic had existed before then, but it didn't become so integral to everyday life until after that. So the two are really linked. And, many of our technologies, from the internet to fast computers have come out of war-related research. It's just a fact of our lives. So that was an important link.
It seems that war is something we really have an easy time spending money on, if we're examining our human history and also our human today, unfortunately. But a lot of money went into researching the development of plastics for military applications during the World Wars. And the production of plastic quadrupled from 1939 to 1945, so just in 6 years. Nylon, which is a polyamide polymer, was invented in 1935 and used for military rope, parachutes, uniform liners, helmets, to name a few. PVC, which is polyvinyl chloride, also a synthetic polymer, was used for waterproofing military uniforms and tents, also for hand grenades and tanks. Rubber, an elastomer polymer, I know lots of big words, but it was used for synthetic tires and goggles for military planes and vehicles. And of course, as you just told us, it was essential in creating the ultimate weapons of mass destruction. And also still for war, because the United States is always at war. We've been continuously involved in a war somewhere for the last 2 decades. And according to Freakonometrics, there have been less than 20 years since the Declaration of Independence where the United States has not been at war. So a lot of plastic is being used for war right now. A lot more could be said on that, but moving on a bit. The last symbol I want to talk about today is the automobile. There is one specific piece of plastic that found its way into your pages, similar to the war relic in the Albatross, but this time it is a car fender. Can you tell me about this artifact and your choice to focus on the automobile industry?
The involvement of the automobile industry in my exploration was a little bit of chance. I was picking up all of the pieces of plastic I found on my daily dog walk and cataloging them. And one day, this large plastic fender liner, about 4 feet long, showed up against my front fence. So, of course, I couldn't ignore that. And I did a little bit of research into it. It actually took me a while to do the research and discovered that it came from a Honda Odyssey minivan, which is a very popular car in the US. And in fact, it came from the very first generation of Honda Odyssey in 1995. So that gave me an opening to really explore the full life cycle of plastic, because this is a piece of garbage that has no use at all anymore, but will last forever. So I wanted to think about, if I treated this with the weight that it actually has as a thing that will last forever, what could I do about it? And what I ended up doing is dragging my family on a trip across the US to Lincoln, Alabama, where all the world's Honda Odyssey minivans are made. They build themselves as a zero waste plant. So we thought we would try to return the car part to them. I understood it as a bit of a theatrical gesture, just to try to make the point that we could take the approach that the people who manufacture and use the plastic need to take responsibility for its end of life. We were not successful in having them take the piece of plastic back. And in fact, it was a suggestion that didn't even really make any sense to them at all, which again was an illustration of, how far as a culture we are from that full responsibility for the life cycle of plastic by the people who manufacture and use it. One that actually didn't even know happened until after I had gone back. My spouse was videoing the whole interaction on a GoPro that was a little bit hidden, because the Honda factory does not let you bring anything in. You can't bring cameras or even notebooks or anything. And our daughter, who was 8 years old at the time, was the ambassador of the piece of plastic and asking them to take it back. And the woman representative from the factory looked at her and said, "Oh, we can't take that. That's yours." And I just felt like rewatching that video, I hadn't heard her say that when I was there. I thought that was so emblematic of how we're leaving plastic for the next generations to figure out what to do with.
Wow, that must have been such an interesting moment to have on tape. I feel like it belongs in a time capsule or something. We talk a bit about the balance between individual and systemic change on this show, and of course, we can each make our own small impact, but blame is such an interesting game to play, right? Because it's like, is it the producer's responsibility or the government's responsibility to regulate the producers, or the public's responsibility to pressure the government? But I do not think that the responsibility of that car fender was that of your 8-year-old at the time. I think by now we've covered the themes in your book on plastic that I wanted to address. However, you mentioned that you spent 20 years in the field of environmental communication, and plastic is one of many issues that you tackle. So I want to ask if there are any other topics you've worked with deeply in the past, or any that you'd like to cover in the future?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. My previous book is a book called Greenwood, which is sort of set in and departs from a 19th century cemetery in Brooklyn, New York that I live near. And the thing that I examined in that book was attitudes in the United States around land and the environment, and came to understand that, the concept of wilderness as a dangerous and bad place that needs to be sort of civilized really comes out of a Judeo-Christian tradition that's a very specific kind of philosophy and way of thinking. And in the United States is also very twinned with, racist and anti-Indigenous kind of attitudes where people who are other than the dominant culture are linked to, uncivilized lands. And I'm working now on a book that's about, more directly than I've written in the past, about my own history as a nuclear colonist in the American Southwest, and what it means to have grown up in a place where actually the majority of the population is Indigenous and Hispanic, and how many of those practices and lands of those cultures have really been, transformed and desecrated by the nuclear industry.
Wow. Okay. I'm definitely excited to follow your work because these topics are very important. Although, despite being so, perhaps we might say they're not always the most uplifting, and it's not going to do any of us any good to succumb to despair about them. So I want to ask you, what is your favorite part about being an author and a poet?
Thank you for asking that. I really support joy and delight in all that we do as a wise practice for sustaining our work. And I have learned that really largely from Indigenous environmental leaders and environmental leaders of color. I have been, as many people have been, influenced by the U.S. Indigenous author Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, a book of essays. And she's actually a botanist by training. She writes that despair is sort of like anesthetizing, and that actually the world gives us so much joy that we have an obligation to return the gift, which I love that characterization of joy as, not something heavy like an obligation, but part of what we're here to do is to experience the joy and wonder of where we are. And I get so much of that as I write and explore and come to understand things I didn't know before. I get to meet a lot of people who are passionate about what they're doing. And that to me is just incredibly life-giving and joy-giving. So that's my favorite thing.
Wow, I love hearing that you love it so much. I want to ask if there's any final thing you'd like to add about anything that we've talked about today.
Because you mentioned guilt, I wanted to talk about the fact that one of the most surprising things that I discovered in writing the book was how much of that guilt around our individual environmental footprint is a creation of the industry. And it's old. So way back in the 1950s, before plastic was in wide use, people in the U.S. state of Vermont started getting concerned about glass pollution, like people throwing their glass soda bottles out along the road. And so they got one of the first bills to require people to recycle. And Coca-Cola and the glass manufacturers got very concerned about this. And they started a campaign in the U.S. that lasted for decades. I experienced when I was a kid, which was called the Keep America Beautiful campaign. And the tagline of the campaign was, "People create pollution, only people can stop it." And so very squarely focused the responsibility for plastic waste onto individuals and away from the manufacturers and away from the companies. And then they also very successfully advocated for recycling programs, municipal recycling programs, which have been shown to be largely unsuccessful. Only about 9% of plastic gets recycled. That was a real surprise to me. The industry also really engineered the idea that plastic needs to be thrown away. That was another surprise to me. As plastic was taking off in consumer goods after World War II, people who had come through the Depression in the US and through a world war were saving their plastic because it's so durable. And the plastic industry understood that if they were to make profits in the future, they needed to shift that behavior. There's a famous quote from a marketer that says, "The future of plastic is in the trash can." And so there were real marketing campaigns around encouraging people to just chuck this plastic because there would always be more new shiny things. So when I give readings and talk to people about this book and about plastic pollution, people who care about these issues feel a lot of sadness and a lot of guilt. And I agree that we can do what we can as individuals, and then a lot of our energy and focus can go upstream on changing laws, changing requirements for companies to be responsible for their waste.
Well, that I think is a perfect note to end on. And lastly, where can people find you?
I'm easy to find at AllisonCobb.net.
Okay, perfect. Well, Allison, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I truly appreciate you coming on the show. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Clark.
All right, a major thank you to Allison Cobb. If you're curious how Allison covered all of these topics that we discussed using poetry, you should be, and you should go track down this book, Plastic, an Autobiography. You can find a link to it in the show notes. I really appreciate Allison's work because I think I've been trying to show throughout the episodes of this podcast so far just how interconnected plastic is. I am using interdisciplinary science podcasting, but I think she did it really successfully through poetry and prose. And if I may, I think both are pretty cool. You've been listening to Plastic Podcast. You can find more information about this week's guest and links to their work in the episode description. Cover art for the show was done by Laurel Wong, and the music you're listening to was done by Tadeo Cabellos. I am your host, Clark Marchese, and this episode was produced, written, and engineered by me. If you found it interesting, send it to someone you know. Plastic Podcast is part of a larger network of sciencey podcasts called Pine Forest Media. You can find more information about us in the episode description or on our website at pineforestpods.com. We're also on Instagram and TikTok at Pine Forest Media, and we've got some exciting science podcasts coming out this year, and a 5-star rating across platforms and a review on Apple Podcasts is one of the best things you can do to help the entire network to grow. Thank you to all of you who have made it this far, and today's review comes from Jeb Def from South Africa, who says, "I've never been one to listen to podcasts, let alone podcasts about environmental matters. But PFM has made engaging with this topic so much fun and entertaining. I think PFM has tapped into a new way of learning, teaching, and presenting that not even Beyonce has thought of yet. Also proud to see a queerly produced podcast emulate such eloquence." Jeb Dev from South Africa, I appreciate you so much. I was just writing in my diary about it. I'm not lying. If you would like your review to be featured on the show, all you've got to do is leave one on Apple Podcasts, and you're probably going to get picked. Now, for the answer to last week's trivia question, the answer was hydrogen. Hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, thanks in part to all of these stars out there that all put together shine just a little bit less bright than all of you listening. All right, kisses. We'll talk soon.